hello everyone. Welcome to the new edition of Sensibility. This month we are looking at the subject of learning to learn, which was a favourite subject of Moshe Feldenkrais, and he wrote a little book about it that is definitely a favourite of mine. Today we have, I have the pleasure of welcoming Carla Reed. She is a long-time Feldenkrais practitioner. She's been practicing, I don't know if as a Feldenkrais practitioner for 40 years, but she's definitely been involved in the method for 40 years. She was, prior to that, a physical therapist that works with children predominantly. I'm keen to ask her about what sort of led her into the Feldenkrais method. But just to add that she is also an Anat Baniel method practitioner, and she previously served as a trainer for that as well. Just one more thing. So Carla is based in Sterling, Virginia. She works with her business, which is Movement to Wholeness, and predominantly working with Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, but also all across the US and internationally as well. So welcome, Carla. I hope that introduction does you justice. It's great to have you on, especially with this subject. So my initial question is around what it was that drew you to the Feldenkrais method, given that you were already involved in physical therapy, working with children.
Well, that's the story of my life. So I actually decided when I was only 14 that I wanted to work with children with brain injuries. So I'm one of those rare people who actually did the same thing my whole life. But I always say it's really never been the same thing because I kept looking for better ways to do it. And so when I heard about Moshe, it was just a flyer I got in the mail on my PT mailing list. But I'm pretty well gauged already when I finished physical therapy, my bachelor's degree in physical therapy, that they hadn't taught me a great deal to do with children. It was just sort of do the same thing you do with the adults. And so I was looking for more. I found the Bobath work of neurodevelopmental treatment of cerebral palsy, but I was beginning to get disillusioned with that after 8 years of being very orthodox about it. And when I got that flyer in the mail, then my ex-husband and I both went to not the 3-day possibility, but the 7-day workshop with Moshe in Los Angeles. And I've often thought in retrospect that if, because, we were lying on the floor doing these movements, which I didn't understand at all. And I was still in the trying hard mode, so I wasn't getting anywhere. And, but in the middle of the workshop, and this is like 350 people in an enormous banquet room in a hotel. And so in the middle of it, he did a demonstration. So what I've thought about in retrospect is if he had done a demonstration on an adult, it might not have changed my path in life, but he did a demonstration on a child. Mm. And he fairly well transformed her in 30 minutes. And I had no idea how he did it or what he did. I just could see that he did. Mm. And so there was like no way I could not train with him. And I had every reason in the world not to. I was living in Arizona at the time and the training was in Massachusetts. I had a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old that I had to leave at home. The training then was 9 weeks straight in Amherst, Massachusetts. But I saw him transform that child and I couldn't not go. Mm. And so that's what happened. He transformed that little girl. I mean, it was, for starters, she was, had all her weight on one leg, almost like she had a hemiplegia, but I found out later she had been injured by being hit by a vehicle. But when he had her lie on the table, it was the days when you still had cords on your microphone, and he took the microphone cord and laid it over her spine as she lay on her belly on the table, and you could clearly see that she had a scoliosis, at least functional scoliosis. And then he proceeded to touch along her spine slowly and delicately all the way up her spine. And I have no idea what he's doing, but by the time he got to her neck, she was asleep. And then he took the microphone cord and laid it over her again, and she was straight. And I was like, sleight of hand? I mean, how did that happen? And then lots of other things, you know, he worked with her and he got rid of the swelling in her leg, and she got up and walked evenly on both legs. And I was like, knocked my socks off. So there was no way I could not train with him in my perception of reality.
Yeah.
And so that's what got me there.
Yeah.
But I was pretty cold. You know, I had never had any other experience except that workshop. That was in April of 1980, and in June I was in Amherst.
Yeah. How did you take to applying it in yourself as well, as the kind of working with other people aspect?
Well, that was hard. I've always said I was actually a pretty slow learner. Even at the training in Amherst, other students there would say, oh, well, you shouldn't have to take 4 years of this training. You already are a physical therapist. And I said, no, I should have to take 8. It's much harder to learn new things when you have the territory already cluttered by other ideas.
Yeah.
And if you come to it fresh, you know, then you just learn about learning. But you don't learn about learning so much in physical therapy school. You learn more about recipes. Like that's a big thing I feel is different. And a lot of these things got emphasized for me more in my time with a knot as well. I've done advanced trainings with many of the trainers. But it's just, I think in physical therapy school, you're more trained that you're supposed to know ahead of time. So you're supposed to know what's the history of the person, what's their diagnosis. And when you have their diagnosis, then you're supposed to know, well, if they have X, then I'm supposed to do Y.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's not nearly as much individualized to the person and how they are being. It's much more about their diagnosis and what's the standard thing for this diagnosis. Yeah. And so that's a huge difference in our work, where we come to the person to see who are they and how do they move and what's the reality of their function, their existence, their understanding, and not so much what's the diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so also that you come to your person that you're working with standing in what you might call the unknown, that you don't know ahead of time. You're going to see when you touch them, when you watch them move, what occurs to you, what comes out of that connection between you and that other human being.
Yeah.
And that's not the way I was trained in physical therapy.
Yeah, because we're not standardized, you know, the result or when we come to it, neither of those are standardized. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So with that in mind, could you maybe give a little information about what it is about the Feldenkrais method that provides the conditions for learning? So maybe to give that a bit of context, the way that you were talking about Feldenkrais there is that we're listening to the individual and that we're trying to understand them and then working with them in a different way than physical therapy does. So with that in mind, what is it that maybe separates Feldenkrais in terms of the learning process that isn't something that's available with standard physical therapy?
Well, I'm always very interested in what I can help the family do to bring into their own interactions with their child the learning moments. So my mantra is making every movement count. And so I spend I don't always just have the child on the table and start touching them and moving them in the ways we think of as a Feldenkrais lesson. I'm immediately thinking of what can the family do in the home environment so that something else occurs. So I think a huge piece of our work, and this is of course continuous in Anat's work, but her focus is much more on children. In that we see that variation is key to the nervous system, to the brain, that the brain literally seeks variation and seeks novelty. And when a child has difficulties, genetic or cerebral palsy or whatever, to me, it's not just, are they spastic, are they this, or are they that, but does their brain generate the variation that a typical baby's brain would generate? And they don't. And so I'm looking right away to bring that variation to them. And so I'm looking to give them the experience of variation so that they have more data to draw from. Because I often explain it to parents that, especially with a child is cerebral palsy, have cerebral palsy where maybe their arms are like this, maybe they're scissoring their legs like this. I said, look at if you think of it like an alphabet, what's their movement alphabet? We have 26 letters in our alphabet, which makes it possible for us to make an almost infinite number of combinations of words and sentences and communication. Imagine how we would communicate if we had only 2 letters in our alphabet. And so what a child, you might say, has 2 letters in their movement alphabet, that no matter what they intend, they always do this and this. And so unless I can bring more variation to their picture, they don't have very many combinations of movement they can make, because it always has just those same movements occur. And with other difficulties like genetic or whatever, the picture is different, but it's still that the brain isn't spontaneously generating the random movement and variety of random movement that a typical baby does. I mean, it's just awesome to watch a typical baby and watch what we think of as just cute wiggles, but they're not just cute wiggles. They're endless variations of movement that they gradually put together in endless, beautiful combinations that we recognize as development.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to ask what does that variation mean? So, I think you just articulated it there, but the more variations a child goes through, the more that kind of builds their developmental process. They start kind of mapping out their body, their environment, what they want.
And when they want to do something, they can draw on their experience of all those variations to pull together whatever is the right combination for what's their intention. But if they don't have all that data, then they can only draw on what they know. So they can try to do something and the same thing keeps happening.
Yeah. Do you think that applies equally to adults? So for example, with the learning process,
yes, it would be a little more challenging to do some of the things I do with the children, with adults, but it would again be important. For example, if you see somebody with a stroke, like you mentioned, in physical therapy and probably in the person's mind, they're just eager to get back up and walk. But what are the endless variations that put together that skill? Because unless they are able to recreate some of the variations, they will, have a very staccato kind of, if they can walk at all, that you'll be able to tell that they had a stroke for sure. Because they'll do the same thing on every step. Whereas if you back them up and do, movements lying down, movements in sitting, movements on all fours, all sorts of different things, then you can help them really recreate the foundation for walking that they lost with the damage from the stroke.
Like building
so
blocks.
They learn to learn again how to walk instead of just thinking that it's brute force or strength.
For sure, yeah. Because I guess that leads to a level of frustration where if they don't have that kind of going back into the process of learning how to walk, that they'll come up against their own inadequacy, and then they will just be like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like I can't do it, therefore I'm not going to.
When you just keep asking them to do something they can't, the children will quit and the adults will quit. They'll just say, I can't do that. Can't you see that? And so you have to back up to find out where is the can. So that they can rediscover their ability that they can. and many things can come out of that.
Yeah, great. So do you think that some of the, I mean, obviously one variations is one that you've articulated. Do you think that there are any other things that have kind of come out of your experience of working with children with disability that have kind of identified something about the learning process that's very clear to you, something that's like, this is such a fundamental aspect of the learning process that is maybe missed in kind of common perception, or, you know, is just really, really useful for us to be aware of?
Well, as I had mentioned to you before, there's a interview on my website that was done with me in Denmark a number of years back, where they talked to me about what's the difference between how I work, having been trained with Feldenkrais and Apagnon, and what I see is regular physical therapy. And so the emphasis in regular physical therapy is often to the higher, most high demand level of what the person can do. And in our work, we go back to bringing the person's attention to what they're feeling. And this is what I see with the children too. So in traditional physical therapy, and as I say, there's a huge range now of physical therapists. Some are innovative and whatever, and some are still doing very staccato, fragmented, old things. And so in the old picture, children are just pushed to try hard. And so they say, come on, stand up straight, stand up straight, stand up straight, and push with effort. And in the Feldenkrais method, we're certainly backed up from that. And in Anat's work, you know, she identified what she called the 9 essentials of how are the ways that you can bring the brain to be learning. And so variation is one of those, and slow is one of those. And subtle, which means less effort. And so I'm always looking to minimize the effort of the child, not try to get them to try hard. And when I minimize their effort, then their attention goes more inward, which is true also with adults. And that also goes to that Weber-Fechner law that Moshe talked about in physics, which is that if you're doing the bigger effort or a bigger stimulus, you have to have a bigger difference to be able to notice. And the example that I always remember using was that, you know, if you pick up a piano and somebody puts a feather on the piano, you're not going to notice that they put the feather on the piano, because your effort is so enormous and the stimulus of the weight of the piano is so enormous that you wouldn't notice the difference of a feather being added to the picture. But if you pick up a piece of paper and you put a feather on it, you might notice the difference. Because you are using so much less effort that the proportion between it and the addition is different, but also it takes your brain's attention to yourself. And so your brain can't tell the difference if you're just struggling, trying hard. And if you scale it back so that it's minimal effort, it also distributes the movement more clearly and evenly through the whole self. And so they have much more ability to figure out how do they bring their weight onto their legs? Where does their head have to be in order to sit up and not fall over? And so I see that is the same thing we're trying to do with adults. As a matter of fact, the way I think of the awareness through movement lessons is that it was just a brilliant way to create ways to get adults to move and pay attention to themselves the way every baby does in their first year of life. He said, I tell the parents all the time, babies are like physicists. The first year of life is physics 101. They are now out of the uterus and they're on planet Earth, so now they have weight. Before they were floating, now they have weight. And so every little tiny wiggle they make gives them an experience, because it carries the weight of their body this way and the weight of their body that way, and they begin to feel where are their movements in space. If they, you know, only have the simple 2-letter alphabet, like I said, then they don't wind up having those movements off of center, because they keep getting stiff at midline. And so I bring those variations into the child's life and teach the parents to do things like even diaper the child from above their head so that you can lift their feet toward their face and get them to pay attention to their legs and move them a little to one side and the other, because they would just keep doing this while you're diapering them. And they never see their feet. And they never get to experience that if I lift my leg and it goes a little this way, my spine turns. And so that's why I look for things like that I can teach the parents too, because I don't think that I have a magic wand that I can transform them in my 45-minute session if the other 23 hours and 15 minutes of the day are not supporting that learning process.
Sure. So I mean, one of the things that kind of pops out to me about what you're saying in terms of slowing down or reducing the effort is that, you know, one, I mean, maybe people have a perception of the Feldenkrais method that it's quite relaxing and that it kind of, you know, lowers the stimulation level in your system, let's say. But it's done for a reason, you know, so it's done not just to have that experience of slowing down and reducing your effort, but because you want to be sensitive enough to be able to judge your next action with that new sensitivity.
Right. And that's a crucial thing. And some practitioners take a while to get that, because it's not just to feel good with the slow movement, but it's how does that fit in action?
Yeah.
That Feldenkrais was not about just being, you know, schmoozy and feeling good and tuning out. He was very much about action.
Yeah.
And so the point of it was to find yourself more clearly so that you bring yourself to action more effectively.
Yeah. So could you perhaps, and I'm sure you've got a lot of experience to draw on, but do you, I mean, maybe something comes to mind, an example from someone that you've worked with that some of the things that we've talked about have kind of been very clear in that child's experience, and the learning process was obvious?
Well, we talked a little before we started about that, that I see with children that have, for example, a genetic problem or cerebral palsy, but are able to move somewhat, but aren't very skillful, that they'll quickly learn to manage the adults in their space. And so, you know, it's appropriate when they're like 3 months old to yell to get parents to do things, but it's not so appropriate when they're 3 or when they're 6 or when they're 10, you know.
When they're adults.
But they learn how to do it because that's not, they don't have any trouble with that part of themselves. They know how to cry and get somebody to pay attention. And so what I find is that you'll have children that don't realize they can learn and don't realize they can be competent except to get mom to do it. And so they want that toy over there, but they don't even try to get it. They just yell to have mom figure out that that's the toy they want. And so what I find is that when I back it up a little, or I make stages so that they can have successes, and discover that they can reach and get the toy they want, that they very quickly move into the kind of learning to learn process that you see in a typical child, where each skill builds on the next. And they get that look that kids get when they discover they can do something.
Yeah.
And so they discover that they can sit up taller. They discover they can pull up to stand, and they're thrilled. And then they stop screaming for mom to do something because they figure out that they can figure it out.
Yeah.
They'll still sometimes have an edge, you know, like I had this little girl with a stroke. She got really competent and feisty, but one day she crawled under my desk chair, and that was just a little further than she knew what to do with, you know. Then she lifted her head and hit the rungs of the chair, and she started crying because she had no idea how to get out of there. And so then I have to scale it back again and see, well, what can you discover in this situation? And so it's this whole process of enabling their process of discovery in every little thing.
It seems that is kind of looking at, I don't know, kind of stimulating their own I don't know, empowerment's like an overused word, but it's like their motivation or confidence, like that you're not just looking at teaching them movement, you're giving them the desire to want to learn, you know.
Right. And the more they get a little bit of a feeling of competence, the more confident they are to try something again. Then they try another something they have not done before. And it just keeps growing like that.
Yeah.
But it has to have a start, and there has to be something that interrupts the old path, you know. So they do get a little angry with me sometimes at the very beginning, because they already figured out the world, and the way the world is that I yell and mom does it, right? And so when somebody comes in and the rules change, initially they can be a little upset.
Yeah.
But then as they get some competence, then they're thrilled, just like every child is.
Yeah.
And then they don't yell for mom anymore, and they don't get mad at me, because they love the challenges once they realize that they can rise to the challenge.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And with the children that have much more severe difficulties, then it's much trickier, because for them it might be, you know, touching your face is a huge skill.
Yeah.
Being able to allow me to lift their legs so that they can see their feet for the first time.
Yeah.
So it's all different depending on what skills they have, who they are.
And I think that that is directly relevant to adults as well, because we all have different levels of competence, and you know, maybe our what we're trying to do, the action that we're interested in, has, you know, some people may be at one point in that achieving that, some may be Olympic athletes, some people might be just needing to learn how to walk better, you know. So I think that it's directly appropriate in that context as well.
And that's, again, a huge difference in our work, because as just a physical therapist, I might just be, you know, trained like I'm supposed to do exercise with them. But personally, I find exercise pretty boring when it's just exercise, when it's not have any context of doing something. And so with the adults as well as with the children, we're trained and we learn more and more from experience how to really tap what's interesting to that person. Because if it's not interesting, they're not likely to do it.
Yeah.
Especially the children. I mean, if they're not interested, well, forget it. You lost them.
Yeah.
So you have to keep changing gears yourself, which is, you know, another one of those 9 essentials that Anak defines one is called flexible goals.
Right.
So you have to keep,
you
know, this is all congruent with our Feldenkrais training as well, because, you know, her work is just her evolution of what she learned from Moshe Feldenkrais. And so it's all the same basket. But it has to be interesting to the adult. It has to be interesting to the child. But I think a big part of working with the adults is that you need to bring their interest back to themselves, because I think that most of us human beings cease to learn after we're about a year old. It's like when we get down the basics and we figure out how to walk, then we just keep doing it the same way we did it, and we don't pay attention to what it feels like anymore.
Right.
And in the first year, the baby is paying attention to everything they feel.
Yeah.
And so in our work in a group, when you teach the group classes or one-on-one, your first job is to actually get them to learn again, to pay attention to what their own body tells them about what do you feel here, what do you feel there, what happens if you do it this way, what happens if you do it that way, instead of just thinking they just have to try harder.
Yeah, right.
Because our culture has greatly supported this brute force.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like as you're saying, that it's not, you're not teaching Feldenkrais to get them interested. You're teaching them how to get interested in themselves.
Right. I mean, they're going to be interested in Feldenkrais per se. They're interested in themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And you need to get them even more interested in themselves.
Yeah.
They didn't even realize they could be that interested in themselves.
Yeah.
And so you bring them back to the learning process that spontaneously occurs with a typical infant, But the brilliance to me of Moshe was realizing that that process of learning is available to us as long as we're still beating our heart and breathing our breath.
Yeah.
It's possible at any age if we go back into learning to learn, then we can do that at any age.
I need to learn how to plug my computer in so that the battery doesn't die.
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's been really fascinating. I don't know if there's anything else that's kind of popped up that you wanted to speak about, or you wanted to kind of mention, given that this, is a kind of public talk.
Well, an example, you asked for an example from my work too. So I've worked a lot with children with cerebral palsy, but I learn from every child I work with. So learning to learn is going on for me forever as well. And learning more and more to approach it from the perspective of wonder, and just say, well, I wonder what would happen if I do this with the child. I wonder what would happen if I put the toy there. I wonder what would happen if I move mom over here. I feel like a props director. But so the one example that comes to mind that really thrilled me too in how it showed the difference between our work and physical therapy is for a short time, a few years after I was divorced, I was working part-time in the nearby hospital that had a pediatric rehab floor. And so I had two children that had Down syndrome that came to me, and they didn't know to seek me out. They just got me by luck of the draw rather than one of the other PTs or OTs. But when they asked me to work there, I told them I don't do regular PT. They said, that's fine, just write your notes. So they were my experience of encountering the difference in learning to learn versus pushing for a milestone. So the children that had Down syndrome that saw the other PTs there and the other OTs, what I noticed is that most of them walked by the time they were 2. But they walked with that sort of waddle that people think of as the way children with intellectual challenges tend to walk, or the way Down syndrome children walk. And so with the children that I saw, when they did move some more, I encouraged the parents not to hold them by their hands, not to say, come here, come here, come here, not to clap when they take a step, but to just keep offering incentives that would get them to pull up to stand and to get back down, and to pull up to stand and get back down, and to pull up to stand and get back down, and then move the things along so that they are cruising side to side and getting down and getting up and getting down and getting up and cruising side to side, which is what a typical baby does for months. Yeah. From the time they pull up to stand until they actually walk. Yeah. They might spend 6 months or more from the time they first pull to stand before they're walking independently. And so I told the parents, don't do any of those things. Just keep doing these incentives to find interesting things for them. And so neither of those children walked till they were almost 3. However, they walked like you and I. They didn't walk with the waddle. Because my perception is they learned how to refine shifting all the weight onto one leg and freeing the other one. Whereas when they waddle, they're like keeping their weight in the center and they're just waddling around it because they never got enough experience of feeling how to shift the weight to one side and the other side, which of course involves your whole spine and your ribs and everything. And but the thrilling part to me was that I noticed that the other children that were coming, that were walking by the time they were 2 to the PTs and OTs, the parents would carry them in and sit them down, and they would sit there sort of blankly waiting for something to occur. And these 2 that I told the parents to just incentivize to get up and down and move sideways, when she'd bring them into the room I was working with, I had to, glue everything down because they took the room like every toddler takes the room. They were into everything. They didn't sit there waiting for something to happen. And so that was a very profound experience for me to realize that a lot of the foundation of cognition is in figuring yourself out and problem solving your own body in relationship to your environment and what you can do. And that the more you problem solve your own body, the more foundation you have, and this is my theory, of course, the more foundation you have for more sophisticated cognition. And so they had curiosity, which is the foundation of learning to learn, that they experienced from doing all these variations and spending the time doing what a typical child does just a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I was thrilled to see that it sort of made them smarter.
Yeah.
As well, that they were much more ready to learn and reached out to learn.
Yeah.
And I thought, if you have that, you can live life if you're in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
As long as you know how to problem solve your world. And
yeah, I think that that's relevant to, it's definitely relevant to myself, but I think to everyone as well, just in terms of that idea of that the goal that you have or that you want to achieve can actually be debilitating in some way, because you get too focused on trying to do whatever you need to get to that goal. But actually what you described there was that they needed to do everything else that you would naturally do without thinking about walking. Like a baby isn't in its head, it's not like, right, tomorrow let me just set my to-do list, tomorrow I need to walk by 9. It's not doing it, is it?
They don't have a timeline. And that's what I always tell the parents. I said, because they will also, when children are stiff and do like this with their legs, they'll say, oh, they're trying to stand up. I'm like, no, I don't think that unless a child is older and cognitively aware, they don't know when they're under a year old that they want to stand up.
Yeah.
They just know they want to see what their body can do.
Yeah.
But we read into them a motivation that isn't necessarily there. I said, everything a typical child does, they do by accident the first time.
Yeah.
They get their head in a certain position that allows them to discover that they can sit up or that they roll over, but they didn't intend to roll over. They just intend to see what that body can do.
Yeah.
And they keep experimenting and they accidentally discover that they went past a fulcrum so that they wound up rolling over or sitting up. And then their brain can reproduce the sensation of what they experienced so that they can do it deliberately.
Yeah. When they want something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great. But really, really useful. And I think it definitely applies not just to that definitely applies not just to children, but to adults in their learning process, and not being too focused on, having a goal in mind, but thinking actually a lot broader and about bringing variety in a way that you're less focused on what you're trying to achieve, and you're more interested in yourself and playing with your experience, basically.
With just a little aside here. I hear a bit of an alarm going in the other room. Can you hear that in the background?
No.
Okay, then I'll ignore it. Just didn't want to distract our audience here.
Yeah, no, I can't hear anything. Well, I'm really pleased to have spoken to you about this. I think that it was perfect to have you on for this subject. If people would like to get hold of you, we will link to Carla's website so that they can get in touch with her directly. She mentioned also a video that she has of her speaking with, I'm not sure exactly who it was, but speaking about the differences between the Anat-Benil method and physical therapy, which you can access on her website.
And the website is movementtoWholeness.com.
Great. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much, Carla, for coming on. I've really enjoyed it. I hope we can speak again at some point. I would like that a lot.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah. So thank you for everything, and we'll see you next time with the Sensibility magazine.
Maybe I'll just say one little other thing.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Which is one advantage of this whole COVID thing is that we've taken on Zoom, and so we have the ability to communicate in a much bigger sphere than before. And so I do consultations on Zoom with, I've done consultations to Bangalore and to New Zealand. And it is more challenging if I've never had the child in my hands, but I can still give them pointers.
Yeah.
And I've also done consultations where a practitioner comes with the child on the Zoom, and I can mentor the practitioners.
Yeah.
So that's also a possibility that people can schedule through.
That's a really good point.
Not close enough to see me in person.
For sure. And if it hasn't been clear throughout this interview that Carla has a wealth of experience and knows a lot about this subject and has worked with multiple different, if you go on her website, it lists some of the conditions that she's worked with. So, if there is something that you're particularly interested in or you need help with, very much recommend going and getting into contact with Carla.
And if they have questions, they can contact me via my email, carla@movementwholeness.com.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, see you all soon.
Okay. Bye now.